Hi, my name is Jackie Lee, and I'm a reporter with Bloomberg Law. Today we're here with Dr. Scott Gottlieb, the Commissioner of the FDA, Food and Drug Administration. Dr. Gottlieb, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So obviously drug pricing has been a very hot topic this past year. And although FDA doesn't specifically dictate to drug companies how they can price their products, you have been very vocal about the need to lower costs for patients. One method the FDA has used so far is to name branded companies it suspects of using the REMS cycle to keep generic drug makers out of the market. What's the FDA's next move in this space?
Well, we don't regulate prices, as you said, and we don't have a role in price competition. CMS, HHS tries to promulgate policies to try to create price competition. What I see my role as is trying to create product competition, trying to get more products on the market so that consumers have more choice and there's more competition in the marketplace for people who are purchasing drugs. So we're going to continue to look for ways to try to create more drug variety in the market, both on the generic drug side as well as the new drug side. So on the generic drug side, you mentioned the REMS. We're continuing to look at ways that we think branded companies might be gaming the system to make it hard for generics to come onto the market. We're continuing to try to increase the overall efficiency of the generic drug approval process. I think one of the things we're going to be talking about a lot next year is trying to lower the cost of generic drug development. So things that we can do to make the generic drug development process itself more efficient, lower cost for generic developers. One of the things that we've observed in the marketplace, and the generic sponsors talk about this, is that costs of generic development have gone up a lot, and you don't see a lot of new entrants in the generic drug space. You don't see new generic drug companies being formed because I think the barriers to entry have gone up, and it was never intended that it would cost $10 or $20 million to file a generic drug application. When I was at FDA back in 2002 or 2003, we used to say that it would cost about $1 million to $2 million to file a generic drug application. Now we know it could cost upwards of $10 to $20 million to file a single application. And it used to be a generic drug category wouldn't be genericized until you reached about $10 million in revenue for the category of medicines. Now you look at categories where there's $50 to $100 million in revenue for the incumbent product that has lost exclusivity, but you don't see generics coming in because it costs more to get in. So we're going to be looking at policies to make it more efficient to get in. So things like reducing the number of multiple cycles of review that generic applications undergo. We recently announced that we're moving towards more of a templated form for how we inspect generic facilities that produce sterile parenteral drugs or sterile injectable drugs to try to bring more predictability and efficiency to how we do generic manufacturing inspections. Those are the kinds of policies where we're going to be focusing a lot of attention. Still continuing to put energy into the places where we have last year, but in 2019 looking at what we can do to make the generic development process itself more efficient for generic manufacturers so we get new entrants. And the other thing we're looking at, we announced a number of policies with respect to biosimilars. So all of the policies that we promulgated to try to reduce gaming in the small molecule space, so situations where sponsors, branded companies are creating obstacles to the generic companies getting access to the doses they need with the REMS programs, for example, or not being willing to sell the doses to the generic sponsors. Those same things are happening in the biosimilar space, in the biologic space. And so we're going to be importing some of the same policy approaches into that space as well, because we see situations where branded companies are using REMS with the biologics to also inhibit biosimilar manufacturers from getting access to the doses of the drug that they need. We're also going to look for ways to make it easier for biosimilar manufacturers to purchase the drugs that they need to do the studies in Europe, where it might be lower cost.
Mm-hmm. And how would the FDA help with that last thing that you mentioned, helping them purchase the samples from the European?
Right. So there are situations where the drugs that are sold in both the U.S. and Europe are being produced in the same facility, the branded company's drug. It's same drug, same facility that's manufacturing it. And the question becomes, can we use the information that we know, when we know they're produced in the same facility, can we use that information to allow a generic manufacturer to purchase the drug in Europe and basically do a comparability study with the biosimilar product as if the drug that they bought in Europe was the same as the drug they would buy in the United States. In situations where we know it is, but the fact that the branded company might be producing the drug for both the European market and the U.S. market out of the same facility might constitute commercial confidential information. So we're looking at whether or not, as a matter of law, whether or not we can use that information in situations where everyone knows that it's the same facility, but it's not sort of widely known in the general public, whether we can use that information. And if not, how much additional studies we'd require it to bridge the European data to the U.S. data. So if you are, if you're a biosimilar manufacturer comparing your biosimilar drug to the branded company's drug, and you purchase the branded company's drug in Europe rather than in the U.S., and you can't just automatically assume it's the exact same drug, even in situations where it's produced in the same facility, you might be able to do a very efficient bridging study to sort of demonstrate that the European drug is the same as the U.S. drug. And the question is, what does that study look like and how efficient can it be? So those are the kinds of ways the FDA can help facilitate the ability of biosimilar manufacturers to procure the drug in Europe. Those are two of the things we're looking at. There's some others, but those are two of the policy questions that we're looking at.
And would Brexit complicate that process at all?
No, I don't see how it would.
Okay. And going back to the cost of generics, traditionally in the space of drug pricing, people usually talk about drug prices being too high. And something I found really interesting that you mentioned a couple of weeks ago at a conference was for some generic drugs that their price is actually too low, and particularly sterile injectables, and that it disincentivizes drug companies from investing in that space. I'm curious what avenues the FDA can use to help those, like through regulation or what have you, to help those drug companies reinvest in that space? And is there any way that the FDA can affect what the price of a generic is?
Well, so we're talking about drugs, typically drugs that are sterile generic drugs. So sterile parenteral drugs, meaning they're used for intravenous infusion. If you look historically at where the drug shortages have been, it's typically been in this space. And so the reason we're concerned about this space is because a lot of these drugs are still important medicines, but they go in and out of shortage. And the reason is that there's been underinvestment in this space over a prolonged period of time. So a lot of these drugs are sold so cheaply that you don't see companies getting into the space to produce these drugs, and then the companies that are in this space don't invest a lot of money back in manufacturing because there's not a lot of profit margins, so there's not a lot of money left over to do upgrades on manufacturing to ensure, for example, continuity of supply. And the other thing we've seen is because these drugs are difficult to produce and expensive to produce, but there's not a lot of profitability in producing them, the way to make money in this space is to do it at huge scale. So there's been a lot of consolidation. So if you look at what's happened in the sterile parenteral drug space, you've had underinvestment in manufacturing over many years because there's not a lot of profitability and not a lot of money left over to invest in manufacturing, and you've had consolidation among a smaller number of manufacturers. So it's the worst of both possible worlds. You have a concentrated number of manufacturers that maybe haven't had the resources to invest in manufacturing to ensure continuity of supply and ensure that manufacturing processes are very modern and very efficient. And so that's why you have shortages. When something goes wrong now in a plant, and things might be more likely to go wrong in this space because of the underinvestment in certain situations, you don't just take down a single drug line, you can take down multiple lines of drugs, of sterile parenteral drugs, and you can see shortages across multiple different drugs. And so the question becomes how to resolve this, and I think it's going to be probably some complement of potentially additional regulatory touch for some category of drugs where you say these drugs are so important from a public health standpoint, we can't allow these drugs to go in shortage. We have to take steps to prevent them from going in shortage. So you might want to say, well, we're going to put in place certain, and it might be certain voluntary requirements where companies might make certain guarantees about the continuity of their supply, but at the same time, we're also going to do something on the reimbursement side to make sure that reimbursement can adjust to reflect those added costs and reflect the fact that these drugs are expensive to produce. So we're really looking for solutions across FDA, CMS, multiple agencies, and that's why the task force that we formed doesn't just include FDA, it includes CMS, it includes the Veterans Administration, it includes the Department of Defense, other payers we've met with to talk to them about what they think the solution should be, because this is going to be a multi-agency approach. I think, and we received a letter from Congress, as you know, from probably around 200 members, bipartisan letter, asking us to do this, asking us to form a working group or a task force to look holistically at the whole issue and try to come up with a more enduring, comprehensive solution to the drug shortage problem. And that's what we're doing. And I think at the end of the day where we're going to end up is probably some recommendations that are both regulatory, where we might say, well, these are the things we think manufacturers should do to ensure continuity of supply. But in these circumstances, for these narrow category of drugs, where we say these drugs are so important we can't allow them to go into shortage, we're also going to do something different on the reimbursement side to allow the companies to take price adjustments that reflect these added costs. Because we can't just, if I just say to the companies, you know what, I think you should be doing these additional things, and I know it's going to cost you money to do it, that's going to be pushing this whole problem in the wrong direction, because part of the reason why we got here with these drugs going in and out of shortage so frequently is because the costs, in many cases, in some cases, it costs more to produce these drugs than companies are recouping. And so the last thing I want to do is impose more costs. We're just going to see additional shortages. It's got to be coupled with a more comprehensive solution.
Mm-hmm. And what is the FDA, in terms of authority, what can the FDA do on a reimbursement aspect?
Well, that's why the answer is not much, and that's why we're partnering with CMS. That's why they're part of the discussion, because there are things that Medicare can do. You know, a lot of these drugs are paid right now, particularly in the hospital side, they're paid under DRGs, so they're embedded in a DRG, and sometimes the DRG doesn't adequately reflect the cost of the drugs. But on the outpatient side, they're paid under the same code, if you will. They're not paid under ASP. So what happens is the lowest cost producer in the category will set the price for the whole category, and even if that producer comes out of the market, it's hard for the price to readjust if other producers, you know, have to produce it at a higher cost because they don't have the same efficiency as the guy who is able to produce it at the lowest cost. So the cost of the reimbursement reflects the lowest cost producer in the market who might not be around supplying the market anymore. So these codes get, you know, as I used to say, they get busted in a way where the reimbursement gets set to the lowest cost producer. That's the way it is in the generic world as well. The lowest cost producer ends up setting the market price typically, but when you're talking about a small molecule drug that's a pill, you know, it's relatively straightforward how to manufacture that kind of a product. And so if the reimbursement reflects some small margin above the cost of goods for the product, you can get away with that because it's you know, not a high-tech process producing a small molecule drug typically. But with a sterile parenteral drug, a sterile injectable drug, where, you know, manufacturing it is not trivial, the cost of manufacturing it isn't trivial, the cost of goods that go into some of these products isn't trivial. So, for example, some of these drugs have platinum in them. They have commodity costs that adjust constantly. You don't want to be reimbursing it at something, you know, just at cost of goods or slightly above cost of goods if you want to have a high-quality manufacturing process where there's, again, margin left over to invest in, you know, manufacturing upgrades to make sure the facilities remain sterile and they put in place you know, procedures to make sure things don't go wrong. There's more margin for mistakes and error when it comes to injectable sterile drugs.
Mm-hmm. So kind of maybe tweaking those codes in Medicare could be a potential
tweaking the process. I mean, there's been some proposals before Congress about pulling some of these drugs out of the current reimbursement scheme and putting them in different reimbursement schemes. You know, that's going to be part of what Medicare contemplates, and ultimately it's going to have to come down to Congress. I mean, Congress is going to need to, you know, have different considerations here, but doing something different with the reimbursement, not for all these drugs, but you would define a category of drugs. I mean, you would say, you know, I don't think you'd say all sterile injectable drugs, but you'd say for a subset of sterile injectable drugs, again, where continuity of supply is really important. And I think part of what we're going to try to do if we go down this path, and I'm sort of, you know, speculating about where we might end up now based on some of the discussions we've had, but, you know, part of what we might do, our obligation might be to work with outside groups, third parties, to define what that category is, because it's not defined now. What are the sterile drugs that are so critical that we don't want to have any change in continuity of supply, but we've seen them go in and out of shortage? And there's probably a definable universe there of, you know, I don't know, dozens of drugs, certainly not hundreds.
Can't talk about priorities in the next year without discussing opioids. Is there anything you guys any initiatives that aren't already in the opioid package that you guys are considering?
Well, we're going to continue to develop evidence-based guidelines next year. We've talked about doing that. We've established a collaboration with the National Academies of Medicine. I think you're going to see us continue to try to promulgate additional treatment guidelines to define what the appropriate dispensing and duration of use should be for opioid use within different clinical settings. Mm-hmm. The one thing we're going to be implementing early with respect to the new legislation that passed is requiring the immediate release formulations of opioids to be dispensed in blister packs. So drugs like Vicodin and Percocet, to have them available in packs of maybe 1 or 2 days, because our data shows when we look at what the optimal dispensing should be or the appropriate dispensing based on indication, the data shows that for most post-surgical indications, you really should be only dispensing 1 or 2 days supply of opioids. And so we think that if we actually had blister packs available with 1 or 2 days supply, more doctors would default to those packs and it would reduce overall exposure. The key here from our standpoint, from one of our roles, is to try to take steps to reduce overall exposure to opioids, and that's going to ultimately translate into reducing the rate of new addiction formed within the medical setting. We have a lot of other roles to play. We're trying to do more to promulgate treatments for opioid addiction. So there's a lot of things that FDA does across the space, but I think focusing on the new year and what we're going to be doing early in the new year, we're going to be promulgating policy to require the blister packs in concert with treatment guidelines that I think in many cases for many post-surgical uses are going to suggest that really you should only be prescribing 1 or 2 days of therapy.
Mm-hmm. And those guidelines coming, are those the indication-specific guidelines?
They're indication-based guidelines. Okay. And the other thing we're talking about is developing policy around creating a population-based standard for the approval, the consideration of new opioids for approval. So, how do we think about when we get an application for a new opioid, how do we think about that new application in the context of all the other drugs that are on the market? And should we be asking the question of whether or not a new drug provides some additional benefit in order to be approved? It's very clear that Congress wanted us. We don't do this in other clinical settings, but it's very clear that Congress wanted us to think differently about opioids. And so one of the things we're considering is whether or not we should have a different standard with respect to how we think about opioids and be looking at them within the context of the overall therapeutic armamentarium. Again, probably something that we'd need to have conversations with Congress about, but we're going to open up that discussion to ask the question of whether or not this is something we should be doing and having a public meeting, putting that question out to the public.
Okay, great. And then finally, to my understanding, the agency is making some changes to its medical device safety regulations. What can developers expect in the coming year?
Right. So what we're trying to do when it comes to medical devices, we're doing a lot of things, but one of the things we're focusing on, which I think you're alluding to, is how we modernize the 510K approval process for demonstrating substantial equivalence to predicates, and how we make sure that the predicates that companies are using as a basis for showing substantial equivalence reflect modern features for safety, for functionality, for materials. Because in the medical device space, as you know, with the 510K process, and this has been some of the criticism of the process, there's cases where sponsors are using very old predicates as a basis for approval of very modern products, and the predicate isn't really approximating the performance standards of that new, more modern device. You think about radiology equipment, for example, that might be approved on the basis of a predicate from the late 1990s. Well, a modern CT scanner or X-ray scanner has many new features, many new safety features. So an old scanner isn't going to have the same features, the same safety parameters. So the question is, how do we move the industry towards the use of more modern predicates? And so what we're doing is we're trying to make it more efficient to develop new predicates through the de novo process, for example, or the ability to use performance standards as a predicate for showing substantial equivalence. At the same time, we're going to be looking at how we can go about advancing policy that would allow us to retire the older predicates. And so we're going to be specifically looking at predicates older than 10 years and see if there's predicates that really are so out of date relative to modern standards that we should consider retiring them, and then ask the question of whether or not we can do that on our own or we would need additional help from Congress. But we're, again, opening up that discussion. And so you've seen us already put out some of the policies on trying to make it more efficient to develop new predicates. Now, 2019, we're going to be focusing on looking at some of the older predicates and whether or not we should be pursuing a policy framework that would allow us to retire some old predicates, particularly in situations where there's been safety questions around the medical devices.
Mm-hmm. And so from a practical standpoint for developers, should they put in some more time? Should they expect it to take a little bit longer while you guys are making these changes?
No, I don't think it's going to affect anything with respect to how we go about evaluating products right now. And products, even if a product was cleared, next year or last year on the basis of a predicate that in the future we might consider retiring, we wouldn't rescind that approval. The product's approved, and any effort to retire certain predicates, there's going to be a grandfathering period because certain companies will be in process using those predicates as a basis for approval. So you'd need to allow a period to transition. So it wouldn't affect any of the current reviews that are underway or anything that's going to be reviewed over the course of the next year. These are just questions. These are the more fundamental questions that we need to start grappling with to think about how we update the overall framework. Remember, this is a 40-year-old statute, and these predicates were established, I think, in 1976 and 1977. Some of them are very out of date. Many of them aren't used anymore, but there's some that are very old that are still being used, and I think those are the ones we need to reevaluate.